Sometimes destiny chooses the smallest life to awaken the greatest miracle. Winter had wrapped Black Pine Hollow in silence long before the sun disappeared behind the snow-covered ridges. Every pine branch bent beneath thick layers of ice, and the narrow river that crossed the forest seemed frozen into perfect stillness. Yet beneath that silent surface, life still struggled to survive. Abigail Brooks, a 24-year-old white Omega known by nearby villagers as nothing more than a quiet herbal healer, carefully gathered evergreen needles and frost-resistant roots along the riverbank before darkness settled completely. She had lived alone inside a small wooden cabin for nearly 5 years, finding comfort among trees, birds, and wounded animals instead of people who rarely understood her gentle nature. While others hurried home before another bitter night arrived, Abigail remained outside because winter herbs could only be harvested before the next snowfall covered them completely. The icy wind stung her cheeks as she secured another bundle inside her woven basket. Then the forest changed. A faint cry drifted through the frozen air. It was so soft that another traveler might have mistaken it for the wind slipping between branches, but Abigail stopped immediately. She listened again. The sound came from the river. She hurried toward the frozen edge, kneeling carefully as she searched beneath layers of cracked ice. At first, she saw nothing except dark water moving slowly beneath the frozen surface. Then she noticed a tiny paw desperately pressing against a narrow opening where the current still flowed. A small wolf cub struggled to keep its head above the freezing water, while broken sheets of ice trapped its body beneath the surface. Its frightened eyes met hers for only a heartbeat before exhaustion began pulling it downward again. Abigail did not hesitate. She dropped her basket onto the snow, lay flat across the ice to spread her weight, and carefully reached toward the frightened animal. The freezing water soaked through her sleeves as she stretched farther than felt safe. The cub whimpered weakly, too exhausted to fight, allowing her trembling hands to gently free one tiny leg before lifting its soaked body from the icy river. The little wolf shivered violently against her chest while she wrapped it inside her thick gray shawl. She whispered soft, reassuring words, although she knew the frightened creature could not understand them. She simply hoped kindness sounded the same in every language. Holding the cub close, Abigail hurried back toward her cabin as snowflakes began falling once again. Inside the warm room, she dried the tiny animal beside the stone fireplace, rubbed warmth back into its frozen paws, and prepared a simple herbal infusion that would help restore its strength. Hours passed while the storm outside grew stronger. The little wolf finally opened its eyes and looked quietly at the young woman sitting beside it. Instead of fear, there was only calm curiosity. Abigail smiled with relief before placing a small bowl of warm water beside the bed she had made from folded blankets. Long after midnight, when she believed the cub had fallen asleep, it slowly stood, walked to the cabin door, and paused. For a brief moment, it looked back at her as though trying to memorize her face. Then it slipped silently into the snowy darkness without making a sound. Abigail watched the closed door for several seconds before quietly returning to her chair beside the fading fire, never imagining that by sunrise, every choice she had made that evening would bring the entire forest to her doorstep. The first pale light of dawn had barely touched the tops of the frozen pines when Abigail awoke to a strange silence. The usual chorus of winter birds had disappeared, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She rose from her chair beside the fireplace, wrapped her gray shawl around her shoulders, and walked toward the frosted window. At first, she believed the snow-covered landscape looked no different than any other morning. Then she noticed movement. Dozens of dark shapes stood perfectly still beyond the edge of her small garden. She slowly opened the wooden door, and the icy morning air rushed inside. Before her, spread across the clearing outside the cabin, stood an entire pack of wolves. Some were enormous with thick silver and black fur that shimmered beneath the rising sun. Others were younger, standing close together while carefully watching every movement she made. None of them growled. None of them showed their teeth. Instead, every pair of eyes remained fixed on Abigail with quiet patience, as though they had gathered for a purpose rather than a hunt. Her heartbeat quickened, but fear never fully settled inside her. The tiny wolf cub she had rescued the night before stepped forward from between two larger wolves. Its fur had already dried, and although it still walked carefully, it carried itself with surprising confidence. The little cub approached her porch, gently touched its nose against her hand, then looked back toward the waiting pack. Abigail slowly knelt and smiled. "You made it home," she whispered softly. The cub responded with a gentle whine before stepping aside. An enormous gray wolf then emerged from the center of the gathering. Age had silvered much of its thick coat, and countless winters seemed reflected within its calm, amber eyes. The magnificent animal stopped several feet away and lowered its head with unmistakable respect. Abigail had never seen anything like it. She knew enough about wolves to understand that such a gesture was not ordinary. It was an expression of trust freely given. The older wolf lifted its head again before turning toward the forest. After taking several slow steps, it paused and looked back at Abigail, waiting. She understood the invitation immediately, although she could not explain how. Returning inside, she placed fresh herbs, clean bandages, a small kettle, dried food, and extra blankets into her worn leather satchel. Before leaving, she added several pieces of smoked venison from her pantry, quietly guessing that the cub might still be hungry after its ordeal. When she stepped outside again, the wolves remained exactly where they had been, waiting with remarkable patience. As soon as Abigail closed the cabin door behind her, the old wolf began walking into the forest. The rest of the pack followed in complete silence, never rushing, never surrounding her too closely, simply guiding her deeper between towering pines where untouched snow reflected the golden morning light. They crossed frozen streams, climbed gentle hills, and passed ancient cedar trees whose branches had witnessed countless winters. Along the journey, birds returned to the forest, landing comfortably upon nearby branches instead of fleeing from the wolves. Small deer quietly watched from distant clearings without showing panic. It was as though the entire forest recognized an unusual peace traveling through its heart. After nearly 2 miles of steady walking, the wolves reached the entrance to a narrow valley hidden behind towering cliffs. Cold mist drifted above the untouched snow while sunlight struggled to reach the secluded hollow below. The old wolf stopped once more before looking directly into Abigail's eyes. Without making a sound, it slowly turned toward a weathered stone shelter nestled beneath the cliffs. From somewhere inside came the faint, uneven sound of someone struggling to breathe. Abigail tightened her grip on her satchel and hurried forward, completely unaware that the next person she would meet carried a destiny far greater than anything she had ever imagined. Abigail stepped carefully into the shelter, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim morning light filtering through the narrow opening above. The air smelled of cedar, damp stone, and fresh pine, but beneath those familiar scents lingered the unmistakable aroma of fever. Resting upon a bed made from evergreen branches and thick wolf pelts lay a man unlike anyone she had ever seen. He appeared to be around 30 years old, with dark hair that had fallen loosely across his forehead and features that remained remarkably calm despite obvious exhaustion. His heavy black cloak had been folded beneath him, revealing clothing made from fine fabric that seemed strangely out of place in such a remote valley. Abigail immediately noticed that one of his sleeves had been carefully torn, exposing an injured arm that had already been cleaned by someone unfamiliar with proper healing methods. She knelt beside him without hesitation and gently placed the back of her hand against his forehead. His skin felt unusually warm. "You have been carrying this fever for quite some time," she whispered, more to herself than to the unconscious stranger. Opening her satchel, she removed several dried herbs, a small tin cup, and a tightly wrapped bundle of willow bark. The wolves remained outside the shelter, watching quietly without crossing the entrance, as though they understood this place now belonged to the healer. Abigail gathered fresh snow in her kettle and placed it above a small stone fire pit. Within minutes, fragrant steam filled the shelter as she prepared an herbal infusion that had been passed down through generations of healers. Once the mixture had cooled enough, she carefully helped the man drink a few small sips. Although he never fully opened his eyes, he swallowed instinctively before settling into a steadier rhythm of breathing. She then replaced the old bandage with clean linen, applying a soothing blend of pine resin and mountain herbs that would encourage healing naturally. As she worked, she noticed something curious. Around the stranger's neck rested a simple leather cord holding a carved wooden pendant shaped like a wolf beneath a full moon. It was beautifully crafted but surprisingly modest for someone dressed in such refined clothing. Abigail smiled softly, assuming it must have been a keepsake from someone important to him. Hours passed quietly. The wolves took turns standing watch outside while others disappeared into the surrounding forest before returning with fresh water or bundles of dry branches, almost as if they understood exactly what she needed. The little cub remained closest to the shelter, curling comfortably beside the entrance every time Abigail stepped outside to gather snow or stretch her tired legs. She found herself speaking to the animals naturally, thanking them each time they seemed to offer silent assistance. Shortly after noon, the man stirred for the first time. His eyelids fluttered before slowly opening, revealing striking golden eyes unlike any Abigail had ever seen. They reflected the sunlight with an unusual warmth that almost seemed to glow against the gray winter sky. Confusion crossed his face as he looked around the shelter before his gaze settled upon the young healer sitting beside the fire. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he managed a faint smile. "Was it you?" he asked softly, his voice rough from fever. Abigail nodded, with quiet humility. "The wolves brought me here," she answered honestly. His eyes shifted toward the entrance where the old gray wolf stood watching peacefully. A look of deep gratitude softened his expression before he returned his attention to Abigail. "Then they trusted the right person," he said gently. She smiled, believing he simply cared deeply for the animals that had rescued him. She had no reason to suspect there was a much greater meaning behind those simple words. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of horses moving somewhere beyond the mountains, but neither Abigail nor the recovering stranger realized that a determined search party had finally entered Black Pine Hollow and was following a trail that would soon change all of their lives forever. By late afternoon, the fever had begun to fade, and color slowly returned to the stranger's face. Abigail added another piece of cedar wood to the small fire before checking the herbal infusion one more time. She was pleased to see that his breathing had become steadier, and the warmth in his forehead had nearly disappeared. The wolves resting outside seemed to sense the change as well. Their quiet alertness softened into peaceful silence, and several of them stretched comfortably across the snow as sunlight painted the valley in shades of gold. The little cub wandered into the shelter carrying a small pine cone between its teeth before dropping it at Abigail's feet, as though presenting a treasured gift. She laughed softly and thanked the tiny animal, earning an amused smile from the recovering stranger. "It appears you have made a loyal friend," he said. Abigail gently scratched behind the cub's ears. "I think kindness has a way of finding its way home," she replied. He studied her expression for a long moment, as though those words carried more meaning than she realized. Before he could answer, every wolf outside suddenly lifted its head toward the northern ridge. Their ears became perfectly still. The old gray wolf rose first, stepping to the entrance of the shelter while fixing its gaze on the distant tree-line. A few moments later, the faint sound Abigail had heard earlier returned, much closer this time. Horses. Many of them. The rhythm echoed across the frozen valley before a line of mounted riders emerged between the pines. They wore dark traveling cloaks fastened with polished silver clasps bearing the image of a crowned wolf. Even from a distance, their discipline was unmistakable. The riders slowed the moment they reached the edge of the valley. Their horses became strangely uneasy at the sight of the waiting pack, yet none of the wolves moved from their positions. A tall man with broad shoulders carefully dismounted and removed his hood. His weathered face reflected both exhaustion and hope as his eyes searched the valley. The instant he recognized the man inside the shelter, emotion filled his expression. Without hesitation, he walked forward alone, stopping several yards away out of respect for the wolves. He placed one hand over his heart before lowering himself onto one knee. Every rider behind him immediately followed. "Your Majesty," the man said with quiet relief, "we have searched every forest and mountain pass for 3 days. Abigail looked from the kneeling riders to the stranger beside the fire, convinced she had misunderstood what she had just heard. The man she had treated with ordinary herbs and simple care slowly sat upright despite his lingering weakness. His calm golden eyes met those of the kneeling captain. "Rise, Nathan," he said gently. "There is no need for ceremony here." Captain Nathan Hayes stood but kept his head respectfully lowered. "The kingdom feared the worst after the storm separated you from your escort." Only then did Abigail fully understand. She stared silently at the man she had believed to be an ordinary traveler. Every piece of the mystery suddenly fit together. The refined clothing, the unusual pendant, the complete trust of the wolves. Before she could step back in surprise, the old gray wolf quietly approached her side and rested against her shoulder, as if reminding everyone present exactly why the pack had chosen her. Adrian, the Alpha King, turned toward Abigail with the same gentle smile she had seen when he first opened his eyes. "Captain," he said warmly, "before anyone thanks me for surviving, you will first thank the woman whose compassion gave me the chance to return. Without Abigail Brooks, neither I nor the little one she rescued would be standing here today." An expression of astonishment spread across every face in the royal escort as they looked toward the quiet healer, while the wolves remained peacefully gathered around her, leaving no doubt where their trust truly belonged. The surprise that settled over the valley did not disappear with Captain Nathan's words. Instead, it deepened into a quiet stillness that even the winter wind seemed unwilling to disturb. Abigail lowered her eyes, suddenly aware that she was standing before the ruler of a kingdom while wearing the same simple blue dress she used for gathering herbs each morning. She instinctively stepped back, uncertain whether she had unknowingly broken some royal custom. Adrian noticed the hesitation immediately. He slowly rose to his feet, still leaning slightly from the lingering effects of his fever, and offered her the same calm smile that had greeted her when he first awakened. "Please do not look at me differently," he said. "You cared for a stranger when you believed he had nothing to offer you. That is exactly why I hope you never see me as a crown before you see me as a person." His words surprised not only Abigail but also every member of the royal escort. Captain Nathan had served beside Adrian for many years, yet even he recognized the unusual warmth in the Alpha King's voice. Abigail finally met Adrian's eyes again and gave a small nod. "I only did what anyone should do," she answered honestly. Captain Nathan smiled respectfully. "With great respect, Miss Brooks, not everyone would have crossed frozen water to save a helpless cub or walked into an isolated valley because a pack of wolves silently asked for help." As the conversation continued, the little wolf cub trotted happily between Abigail and Adrian before sitting proudly beside the healer. Several larger wolves followed, forming a quiet circle around them. One by one, each wolf lowered its head toward Abigail. The movement spread through the valley like a gentle wave until the entire pack stood in silent respect before her. Even the royal guards stared in disbelief. Nathan quietly whispered to one of the younger soldiers, "I have witnessed these wolves honor only one person before today." The soldier answered almost under his breath, "His Majesty." Adrian looked across the gathered pack with thoughtful eyes before reaching beneath his cloak. He removed the wooden pendant Abigail had noticed earlier and carefully untied the leather cord. The carving depicted a wolf standing beneath a full moon surrounded by cedar branches. Time had polished the wood until it carried a soft golden glow. Adrian stepped toward Abigail and placed the pendant gently into her hands. "This belonged to my father before it belonged to me," he said. "It has always been carried by the one entrusted with protecting those who cannot protect themselves. I believe it has already chosen its next guardian." Abigail's eyes widened with surprise. "I cannot accept something so valuable," she replied softly. Adrian gently closed her fingers around the pendant. "Its value has never come from the wood. It comes from the heart of the person who carries it." Before Abigail could answer, the old gray wolf approached once again and rested its head briefly against the pendant in her hands. The rest of the pack answered with low, peaceful howls that echoed through the snowy cliffs without sounding threatening. The valley itself seemed to welcome the moment. As daylight slowly faded, Captain Nathan ordered a comfortable camp to be prepared nearby so Adrian could regain his strength before traveling. Yet despite the tents, warm fires, and careful attention of the royal escort, the Alpha King chose to remain beside the small shelter where Abigail had cared for him. Throughout the evening they spoke not about kingdoms or titles, but about forests, changing seasons, healing herbs, and the quiet comfort found in simple acts of kindness. By the time the first stars appeared above Black Pine Hollow, every person in the valley understood that something far more enduring than gratitude had begun to grow between the humble healer and the Alpha King, while the wolves watched over them with the peaceful certainty that destiny had finally found exactly where it belonged. Morning arrived beneath a sky as clear as polished crystal, and for the first time in days the valley welcomed sunlight without the weight of another storm. Snow resting upon the cedar branches sparkled like countless tiny stars while gentle wisps of mist drifted above the frozen ground. Abigail prepared another pot of warm herbal tea as Adrian stepped outside the shelter, moving with steady confidence instead of careful caution. His strength had almost completely returned, yet he remained in no hurry to leave the peaceful valley that had unexpectedly become a place of healing rather than hardship. The wolves greeted him with quiet affection before several of them wandered toward Abigail, patiently waiting beside her as though her morning routine had become part of their own. The little cubs circled happily around her boots before carrying a small bundle of evergreen branches toward the fire. Captain Nathan watched the scene from nearby with an expression that mixed admiration and disbelief. During all his years serving the royal household, he had never witnessed the royal pack behave with such open trust toward anyone outside their own family. One of the younger guards quietly approached him and whispered, "They follow Miss Brooks more naturally than they follow our commands." Nathan smiled faintly, without taking his eyes off the wolves. "They are not following orders," he replied. "They are following their hearts." After breakfast, Adrian asked Abigail if she would walk with him to a quiet overlook above the valley. The old gray wolf and the little cub accompanied them while the rest of the pack remained peacefully below. Together they climbed a gentle trail that overlooked miles of snow-covered forests stretching toward distant blue mountains. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and cedar while eagles circled gracefully above the cliffs. Adrian rested one hand upon the weathered trunk of an ancient cedar tree and looked across the wilderness with quiet gratitude. "Every ruler is taught how to protect a kingdom," he said softly. "Very few are taught that sometimes the kingdom protects its ruler." Abigail looked toward the wolves below. "Perhaps they knew you still had something important left to do." Adrian turned toward her with thoughtful eyes.
"No.
"I believe they knew I still had someone important left to meet." His words were spoken with such quiet sincerity that Abigail found herself smiling without realizing it. Before either of them spoke again, the old gray wolf stepped between them carrying a long cedar branch that had naturally fallen from the ancient tree. It placed the smooth piece of wood gently at Abigail's feet before lowering its head once more. Adrian picked up the branch and examined it carefully. The grain formed a beautiful spiral that resembled the flowing pattern carved into the pendant now resting around Abigail's neck. Using a small knife from his travel pack, he carefully shaped one end into a simple walking staff before presenting it to her. "Every healer deserves something that will walk beside them through every season," he said. Abigail accepted the cedar staff with quiet appreciation, feeling its comforting warmth despite the winter air. At that very moment, every wolf in the valley gathered below the overlook. Without any command from Adrian or the guards, the entire pack lifted their eyes toward Abigail and slowly bowed together. Captain Nathan removed his gloves and placed one hand over his heart, understanding the meaning of the moment better than anyone present. The royal wolves had not merely accepted the young healer. They had claimed her as someone forever worthy of their trust. As the afternoon sun slowly drifted westward, preparations began for the journey back toward the kingdom. Yet no farewell felt final, because every person in the valley sensed that the path connecting Abigail Brooks and the Alpha King had only just begun, and the forest itself seemed content to quietly guard the promise that destiny had planted beneath its ancient pines. The journey back from the hidden valley took 2 quiet days, yet every mile seemed lighter than the one before. Abigail returned to her small cabin, carrying the cedar staff in one hand and the carved pendant resting gently against her heart. When the royal escort reached the edge of Black Pine Hollow, Adrian brought his horse to a stop instead of continuing toward the capital. He looked at the little cabin surrounded by snow-covered pines and smiled. "Every kingdom needs places that remind its people who they truly are," he said. "This forest has become one of those places for me." Before departing, he handed Abigail a sealed envelope marked with the royal crest. "Do not open it until the first day of spring," he said. "It is not a command. It is only an invitation." Abigail accepted the letter with quiet gratitude, watching as the royal escort slowly disappeared beyond the winding forest trail. Life soon returned to its familiar rhythm. Each morning she gathered herbs, tended her small garden beneath the melting snow, and cared for injured birds, rabbits, and deer brought to her doorstep by the changing seasons. Yet something had quietly changed throughout Black Pine Hollow. The villagers who once greeted her with little more than polite distance now paused to thank her for simple remedies or ask gentle questions about healing plants. None of them fully understood what had happened beyond the mountains, but stories had begun spreading from travelers who claimed the Alpha King himself had spoken publicly of an unknown healer whose kindness had saved more than one life. Weeks later, as winter gradually surrendered to spring, the first wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth. Abigail remembered Adrian's request and carefully opened the royal envelope beside her fireplace. Inside rested a beautifully written invitation asking her to attend the Spring Renewal Festival at the Royal Palace as an honored guest. There was no formal language demanding her presence, only a handwritten sentence beneath the official seal. A kingdom should meet the woman its wolves trusted before anyone else did. Abigail quietly read those words twice before folding the letter again. She had never traveled beyond neighboring villages, much less visited a royal palace. The thought alone filled her with uncertainty. She looked toward the cedar staff resting beside her door and gently touched the wooden pendant around her neck. The memories of the peaceful valley, the old gray wolf, the playful cub, and Adrian's sincere kindness slowly replaced her doubts with quiet courage. Several mornings later, she began the journey toward the capital in a simple wagon offered by grateful neighbors who insisted she should not travel alone. Along the road, she passed blooming orchards, green hills, and busy market towns alive with music after the long winter. Everywhere people spoke excitedly about the coming festival and the Alpha King's recent return. Some praised his wisdom while others wondered about the mysterious healer mentioned in whispers throughout the kingdom. None of them realized she sat only a few feet away, listening quietly, with a gentle smile. By sunset on the third day, the royal capital appeared beyond the rolling hills. Tall stone walls surrounded graceful towers whose banners danced in the warm spring breeze. The palace itself rose above the city with elegant white columns and gardens already filled with flowering trees. Waiting at the open gate stood Captain Nathan Hayes, wearing his formal uniform but smiling with the same warmth Abigail remembered from the valley. He stepped forward, bowed respectfully, and said, "Welcome, Miss Brooks. His Majesty has been looking forward to this day ever since he left Black Pine Hollow." As the great gates slowly opened before her, Abigail took a steady breath and crossed into a world completely different from the quiet forest she had always called home, unaware that the greatest surprise of her journey was still waiting just beyond the palace gardens. The Spring Renewal Festival filled the royal capital with music, laughter, and the fragrance of blooming cherry trees that lined every avenue leading to the palace square. Families gathered beneath colorful banners while musicians welcomed the changing season with bright melodies that echoed through the marble courtyards. Abigail walked quietly beside Captain Nathan, feeling both amazed and humbled by the beauty surrounding her. Although she wore the same simple blue dress she had always cherished, the cedar staff in her hand and the carved pendant resting around her neck reminded her that kindness had carried her farther than wealth or status ever could. As they entered the grand courtyard, hundreds of guests turned toward the royal platform where Adrian stood dressed in an elegant black ceremonial cloak trimmed with silver. His expression immediately softened the moment he saw Abigail. Instead of waiting for her to approach the throne, He calmly descended the wide marble steps to greet her halfway across the courtyard. The unexpected gesture caused quiet whispers to spread among the assembled nobles. Many exchanged puzzled glances, wondering why their Alpha King welcomed an unfamiliar village healer with such obvious respect. Adrian smiled warmly as he reached her. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," he said. Abigail returned his smile. "I almost believed this place belonged only in stories." Adrian looked around the vibrant gardens before answering. Palaces become meaningful only because of the people welcomed inside them. Together they walked toward the ceremonial platform while the crowd watched with growing curiosity. Several members of the royal council studied Abigail carefully, unable to hide their uncertainty. One noble quietly remarked that a simple healer from a distant forest hardly seemed suited for such recognition. Another wondered whether the stories surrounding her had become exaggerated during their journey across the kingdom. Adrian heard every whisper, yet remained completely composed. When the festival reached its opening ceremony, he stepped before the gathered citizens and spoke with calm confidence. He thanked the people for their courage during the long winter and celebrated the arrival of spring as a season of renewal, compassion, and hope. Then his voice grew gentler. "Several weeks ago, I disappeared during a powerful storm. Many believed I would never return. The person responsible for bringing me safely home did not know my title, my family, or my kingdom. She simply saw someone in need and chose kindness without expecting anything in return." Every eye turned toward Abigail. She lowered her gaze modestly, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Before Adrian could continue, a familiar sound drifted across the palace gardens. A peaceful chorus of wolves echoed beyond the palace walls. Moments later, the great gates slowly opened. The royal wolf pack entered the courtyard with graceful confidence. Citizens stepped aside in respectful silence as the magnificent animals crossed the marble stones without fear or aggression. At their head walked the old gray wolf, followed closely by the playful cub that Abigail had rescued from the frozen river. The little wolf hurried directly toward her, happily circling around her feet before sitting proudly beside the cedar staff. Then something extraordinary happened. The old gray wolf lowered its head before Abigail. One after another, every member of the royal pack repeated the same gesture until the entire courtyard stood in complete silence before the remarkable display of trust. Even the skeptical nobles found themselves speechless. Adrian looked across the bowed wolves before addressing the crowd one final time. "Titles may command obedience, but only character earns trust freely given. Before any of you knew Abigail Brooks, the guardians of this kingdom recognized the truth already living within her heart." As warm spring sunlight filled the courtyard, applause slowly rose from every corner of the palace until it became a joyful celebration, not only of a humble healer, but of the quiet strength that had united a kingdom through nothing more powerful than compassion. The festival remained the favorite conversation throughout the kingdom for many weeks, yet Abigail never allowed the attention to change the quiet rhythm that had shaped her life. A few days after the celebration ended, she thanked Adrian, Captain Nathan, and the palace staff for their kindness before beginning the journey back to Black Pine Hollow. The royal carriage offered to take her anywhere she wished, but she asked to be dropped at the edge of the forest, explaining that the final miles home were best traveled on foot beneath the familiar pines. Adrian understood, without needing further explanation. Before she departed, he handed her a small leather journal filled with blank pages. "Every healer gathers wisdom that deserves to be remembered," he said with a gentle smile. "Perhaps one day someone else will need the kindness these pages will hold." Abigail accepted the gift with quiet gratitude, promising she would fill it with remedies, observations, and stories from the forest that had always been her greatest teacher. As the weeks passed, spring slowly transformed Black Pine Hollow into a place overflowing with new life. Wildflowers covered the meadows, songbirds returned to every branch, and the frozen river where everything had begun flowed once again beneath bright morning sunlight. Abigail resumed her simple routine, tending herbs, helping injured animals, and welcoming neighbors who now visited not because of rumors or curiosity, but because genuine respect had replaced old assumptions. Children often gathered outside her cabin to learn the names of healing plants, and she happily taught them that every flower, tree, and stream had its own purpose if people took the time to notice. One peaceful evening, just as the sun dipped below the western hills, a familiar chorus echoed gently through the forest. Abigail stepped onto her porch with a knowing smile. Emerging between the towering pines came the old gray wolf, the playful cub that had now grown stronger, and the rest of the royal pack. They settled quietly around the clearing exactly as they had on that unforgettable morning months before, except now there was no uncertainty in their presence. They had simply come to visit a trusted friend. Moments later, another familiar figure appeared along the narrow forest trail. Adrian walked without royal ceremony, dressed in a simple dark traveling cloak instead of formal robes. There were no banners, no guards announcing his arrival, and no throne waiting beyond the trees. Captain Nathan followed several steps behind, carrying only a small basket filled with fresh bread, fruit, and tea before quietly leaving the two friends to enjoy the peaceful evening together. Adrian looked around the cabin with genuine contentment.
"I
believe this place becomes more beautiful every season," he said. Abigail laughed softly. "Perhaps you simply notice more now than you did before." He smiled because he knew she was right. They spent the evening sharing tea on the wooden porch, while the wolves rested peacefully nearby, and fireflies slowly appeared among the wildflowers. Neither of them spoke about destiny, titles, or extraordinary events. They spoke about ordinary things that quietly make life meaningful: the arrival of migrating birds, the first berries of summer, children learning to care for nature, and the simple comfort of having someone who understood the value of kindness without needing it explained. As twilight settled over Black Pine Hollow, the little wolf curled comfortably beside Abigail's feet while the old gray wolf rested beneath the porch, watching the peaceful forest with calm satisfaction. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river continued its endless journey, carrying with it the memory of one small act of compassion that had forever changed countless lives. And in that quiet corner of the world, where crowns mattered less than character and trust was earned through gentle hands instead of powerful words, everyone who passed the little cabin came to understand the lesson that would be remembered for generations: that true strength is always gentle, and the greatest destinies often begin with the simple decision to help someone who cannot ask for it.